If you were a young woman who had gone through something very traumatic in your childhood, but were now in a much more healthy, stable, happy place, it would make total sense to go back home to your childhood home where all of that trauma occurred. Nothing could go wrong, right? Red Kingdom Rising is an independent horror film written, directed, and produced by Navin Dev, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. The film premiered at Portobello Film Festival in 2012, as well as a few other film festivals, and then had a limited DVD release in 2014, and then faded into obscurity. Prior to this film, Navin Dev had only worked on short films, and since this film he's written and directed the 2019 film Zoohead. I first heard about this movie around 2011 or 2012, I believe, when a trailer came out on YouTube. At the time, I wasn't really in a place where I could actively follow the news of the film, but I assumed that I would hear when it came out in theaters, but it never did. It only had a limited DVD release, so it wasn't until recently that I looked into it again and was able to find the film. Unfortunately, due to the obscurity of this film, it's not exactly easy to find a legitimate copy. If you do want to watch it, I'm sure you could find it out there, although I'm not sure I would recommend it. This film features an unknown cast of exactly 6 actors. Emily Stride as the main character of Mary Ann, Wendy Battersby as Mary Ann's social worker Esther, Sylvana Maimone as Mary Ann's mother, David Caron as Mary Ann's father, Sienna Ford as a unnamed child at the school/daycare that Mary Ann works at, and Italia Turnbull as the Cheshire Cat/Alice/the younger version of Mary Ann. The cast overall does a pretty decent job with the material that they have, although I will say that Italia Turnbull's performance is the standout of this film. She just seems like she's having so much fun while wearing that Cheshire Cat mask, and it's an absolute highlight of the film. So why don't I know if I can recommend this film? Well, there are a few things, and there will be spoilers ahead. Additionally, I feel like I need to provide a warning that the content of this film contains childhood abuse, childhood sexual assault, and a lot of other triggering things that may not be for everyone. So proceed with caution. So as a very brief summary of the film, it begins in an unpleasant dream sequence where Mary Ann is being felt up by the Red King, who is this gory, hooded figure, and he reaches inside her stomach and pulls something out. Not pleasant. Mary Ann then wakes up and goes about her day. She talks to the social worker and discusses the fact that she is going to visit her mother now that her father has died to check on her well-being. During this conversation with the social worker, it's revealed that not everything is going very smoothly for her, as she works at a daycare/school, and some of the parents have complained about some of the inappropriate stories that she has been telling the children. So she goes back to her childhood home to check in on her mother's well-being, and it is very clear from the get-go that her mother is not doing so well. Her mother seems to be trying to perform some sort of cleansing ritual on the house. So Mary Ann goes to sleep and enters this sort of trauma dream situation where she uncovers a lot about her past. And it all culminates in her coming to terms with what happened to her and accepting it and loving herself and moving on, as all good trauma films wrap up that way. So the major story of this film revolves around the parental abuse that Mary Ann suffered. Her mother was physically and emotionally abusive, wanting the family to be perfect. And her father was sexually abusive and wanted to constantly shape Mary Ann into his Alice. I think it was an interesting choice that Navin Dev chose to make a film on this topic as his first feature-length film after only working on shorts. Abuse of any kind is a sensitive subject that needs to be dealt with delicately, so it is a massive risk to take on as your first feature-length film. As any artist would know, the vision that you have in your head of the final product is often not what the final product looks like, particularly on the first try. and your first attempts at something often have some clumsy techniques and things that didn't work out quite like you'd hope they would. In the case of this particular film, I do think there are some things that work well, and some things that do not work as well. And in the end we got a rather mediocre product that isn't terrible, but isn't particularly great, and probably isn't as provocative or meaningful as was originally intended. There are some things in this movie that I think are done well. The editing and pacing are done particularly well as they build up tension towards the reveal of who the Red King is. I also think that the flashback scenes are good and well timed. The Alice in Wonderland imagery when Alice first arrives at the house is also pretty fun. I think that overall the biggest weakness of this film is the story. The concept is good, but the execution is muddled and confusing. There are only 6 characters in this film, so almost all of them play some significant role. The exceptions to this are Esther, the social worker, who really is only there as an exposition dump, and the girl at the daycare/school that Marianne works at, who is just kind of there some of the time. Marianne is the main character and obviously plays a significant role throughout the film, along with her mother and father, who are the main antagonists of the film. And Alice as a character is also hugely important as she acts as a guide for Marianne, as well as representing the younger version of herself. Marianne and her mother never appeared to have a close relationship. Within the film, this is also represented by shackles resembling an umbilical cord connecting her mother and the younger version of herself, as her mother punishes the younger version of herself. Her mother was also silent about the abuse that Marianne suffered at the hands of her father, which she was aware of. Towards the end of the film, her mother is captured by the Red King and is seen tied up and being tortured, and she asks for forgiveness from Marianne. And Marianne refuses forgiveness. And I really do have to give the movie props for this. Often forgiveness is touted as a way to heal and move on from trauma, when it actually more commonly is used as a further abuse tactic to keep victims in their place and silent and continuing the cycle of abuse. It's essentially often used as a control mechanism in an abusive relationship. So Marianne not forgiving her mother in this moment is actually a huge step towards her own personal healing journey and not really a negative thing. It's a hugely positive thing. And I give the movie props for that, because I don't think most movies would have portrayed it like this. As a child, Marianne did appear much closer with her father, who sort of seemed like the safe parent compared to her mother initially. Marianne and her father connected through reading Alice, and her father took advantage of their close relationship by sexually assaulting her on multiple occasions. In this film, the father is represented by the Red King, the main antagonist of the film, still haunting Marianne's dreams to this day. Although we do see this abuse occur through a flashback within the film, it doesn't seem to be the main truth that needs to be uncovered through the story. So the main twist appears to be that Marianne's father impregnated her through the abuse, and Marianne is in denial about that, I think? Towards the end of the film, we are shown a weird, gory, furry creature with a baby's cry that was the thing that was extracted from Marianne at the beginning of the movie. This being is also seen throughout the film as a lump of fur that purrs on occasion. So at the climax of the film, the Red King is sort of showing Marianne this gory baby thing, and to defeat the Red King, she takes that baby and shoves it back inside her. It's weird. I'm really unsure about what this was trying to depict. If it really is about her being pregnant as a child through incest, this is a weird way to conclude that story. If I was to try to pull out some deeper meaning that was trying to be brought across, I could say that her father stole her innocence away from her, and this was her reclaiming it towards the end of the film. But that really does feel like a reach. That's just speculation on my part. It's not really what the film shows ultimately. And if that's really what they wanted to come across, they needed to present it better. I truly feel like I'm grasping at straws trying to interpret what was going on here. So I want to bring up something that might be classed as a nitpick, but I still think it warrants a discussion. So Marianne goes to her childhood home with the intention of checking in on her mother. And when she gets there, she does that, and it's very clear her mother is not coping. She even calls Esther, her social worker, and tells her she's gone mad, she's crazy. Whatever is going on with her mother has gone well beyond grief and is something that needs professional intervention. She needs help beyond what Marianne can provide. Despite this, Esther just ends the phone conversation with, "Just make sure that she's okay and then leave." She's not okay, clearly, and Marianne does nothing about it. She does nothing. She goes to bed and falls asleep. She doesn't call anyone for her mum, she doesn't contact medical health professionals, she does nothing. And I'm pretty sure most people in this situation would call a mental health professional. Particularly as I believe this film is set in the UK and the mental health triage would definitely step in at this point. I just think it's really odd that Marianne does nothing to help her mother. Within the dream sequence, Marianne's mother is killed by the Red King. Not sure if this happens in real life though. Not sure whether Marianne's mother is dead or alive because it's not confirmed. At the end of the movie, Marianne just wakes up, checks around the house for a little bit, and then leaves. We get no confirmation about whether or not the mother is still alive or okay or what's going on there. Marianne finds her bloody dress and then just decides that that's enough evidence for her and leaves. We never get any confirmation about this, and it really bugs me. I just don't understand why this particular plot point lacks resolution. Overall, the cinematography is good. I like the way a lot of the shots are framed, and I like the way that the lighting brings across a dark atmosphere while still being able to visually see the scene. There is one scene that I really do not like though. It's one of the very first scenes where Marianne is at the school/daycare that she works at. Visually, this scene is very discordant with the rest of the film, and I'm not entirely sure why, although I have some theories. The bright unnatural pink doesn't really match with the rest of the film's tones of more natural colours or more muted colours. The framing and lighting also does no favours in this scene, as the faces, which we are supposed to focus on, are visually the least interesting thing about the shot. It also adds no new information to the story. All of the points relayed in this scene were relayed literally just the scene before with Esther. So with Esther, she talked about how she was telling dark fairy tales to the children at her daycare/school. The parents were complaining, and that she was going to go visit her mother. With the child at the daycare, the child asks whether they could continue their story, and she asks why Marianne has to go away for a little while. No new information is revealed here. It's all the same. The scene adds nothing. It could be cut out of the film and it would make no difference. It would probably even improve the film. If I was desperately trying to find a reason to keep and include this scene in the final product of the film, you could say that this is a contrast to the rest of the world that Marianne knew. Maybe it could represent the contrast between the childhood that Marianne had and the childhood that these children have, but it really doesn't seem like it was that purposeful. It doesn't seem that well thought out. I truly do not think that this scene belongs in the movie. We do visit this location at the end of the film, but it feels less out of place than it did at the beginning. I think the difference in framing and the shot-reverse shot really make the difference here. Even the wide shot looks a lot better with the 45-degree angle compared to the straight front shot from earlier. So I've already talked about some of the Alice imagery that's in this film, and it's lifted from both Alice's adventures in Wonderland as well as Through the Looking-Glass and what Alice found there. Within this film, the books exist and are very meaningful to the characters. As Alice was the main way that Marianne connected with her father, it makes sense that her childhood abuse is viewed through the lens of Wonderland. The most referenced part of Alice is the conclusion of Through the Looking-Glass, where it talks about the experiences of that particular book and whether they were Alice's dream or the Red King's dream. And this theme of whether or not the dream belongs to Marianne or her father continues to play out through the film, as it's a representation of how Marianne is struggling to maintain control over her life with her father's abuse from childhood hanging over her. I don't mind this framing. I think that it's reasonably well done, although I'm not really sure why they chose the aesthetics they did for the Red King. He doesn't really look much like a king, he kind of just looks like a zombie in a red cloak, and I'm not a huge fan of it. Within the film, Marianne's mother is depicted in a way that might align her with the Duchess in Alice in Wonderland, although this is a reasonably loose connection. It really only comes up because on a few occasions, Marianne's mother calls the younger version of herself a pig, and that's really it. Ultimately, her mother doesn't have that many connections with Alice in Wonderland motifs, which makes sense because it is the way that Marianne and her father connected, and not Marianne and her mother. Marianne's mother seems more aligned with Christ and Christian symbols than anything to do with Alice in Wonderland. The young Alice, as mentioned previously, is the absolute highlight of this film. She carries the whole thing in my opinion. When we first see her, she's dressed as Alice, but also has the Cheshire Cat mask on. She acts as a sort of guide for Marianne through the dream. She offers cryptic advice and snarky commentary. And you can absolutely tell that this kid is having so much fun in this role. The line deliveries are excellent, and they are my favourite part of the movie. So I want to take this time to show you some of my favourite lines from this character.
I'm a cat. Is it now? Okay, here. Go ahead. Drink. I'd love to see what happens. So you're 25! What an uncomfortable age. Or maybe you're just mad. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling.
Later in the film, we see young Alice with her mask taken off as she's been captured by the Red King. And behind the mask, she doesn't appear to have a face. This seems to be depicting Marianne getting closer to her inner child, but not quite seeing her yet. After the Red King is defeated, Marianne peels back this layer, revealing the face of her younger self as Alice. And she is now connected with her inner child and ready to do the work of healing. Although, I think maybe this film is trying to depict it as the end of the healing journey and not the beginning, which is not accurate, but you know. I think that the casting of Italia Turnbull as this role was impeccable. She does a great job of being playful earlier, as well as really somber and sad in the scenes where she's playing young Marianne. Her face just always looks so sad. It's brilliant. You look at her face and you want to protect her. There are some other motifs here and there, with the white rabbit being at the entrance of the cellar, the cat in the house to represent Dinah, a little toy tea party in Marianne's room as well as later in the dream, the chessboard in the living room, white flowers that are painted red with blood. These additions really seem to be mostly set dressing and don't appear to have any deeper symbology behind them. Ultimately, I have mixed feelings about this film. It wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't fantastic either. Unfortunately, I do think my memories of the trailer had raised it to something it wasn't in my head, and the film definitely didn't live up to it. As I mentioned earlier, the thing that I find particularly at fault is the story. It should be noted that writer/director/producer Navin Dev was inspired by real-life accounts of adult survivors of childhood abuse. And to my knowledge, he does not have any direct experience with such childhood abuses. And as far as I can tell, there wasn't anybody who was directly familiar with those experiences that had any input on the story of the script. I point this out not because I believe that survivors are the only ones who can tell this type of story, but because it's important when you're telling this type of story to be sensitive to the issues that you are discussing. It's incredibly important to be intentional and thoughtful with what you do in this area. You need to ask why you're telling the story and who you're telling it for, and who this is going to ultimately impact. Personally, I don't think that the subject matter here was dealt with in a particularly sensitive way, and it's definitely a form of therapy that I'm not sure that anybody would really recommend. Now, exposure therapy is definitely a thing, But this kind of exposure therapy is not really a thing. I don't think that anybody would recommend seeing an abusive parent who is in an emotionally heightened state as a way of healing from trauma. And I don't think that anybody would recommend going back to the place where your trauma occurred, where your abuse occurred, as a way to reconcile with that. It's just not really how trauma and trauma therapy works. You really shouldn't be putting yourself in re-traumatizing situations as a way to try to heal. It is a bit of a misconception in media that you need to directly face the thing that traumatized you in order to get over it, but that's really not recommended or how it works in my experience. So I'm not sure if I would recommend this movie. It's not bad, but it's nothing really exceptional. Although, I will say, for me, Italia Turnbull's performance really made it worth watching. I genuinely hope that I can see more from her in the future because I think that she's an exceptional talent. I don't personally think I'll be viewing anything from Navin Dev in the future though. But what do you think? Have you seen Red Kingdom Rising? Did you like it? Did you have problems with it? Let me know. And also let me know what other Alice-inspired material you think I should cover. I've been a Vodka Cat, and I'll see you at the tea party.